In the spring of 1959, at a livestock dispersal sale outside of Livingston, Tennessee, a 31-year-old woman named Corinne Vickers paid $65 for something the auctioneer described, without any apparent embarrassment, as a lot of 4 Randall lineback cattle, 3 cows, and 1 bull, all of them old-fashioned, all of them slow-growing, and none of them, in his professional estimation, worth the feed it would take to winter them through to March. The auctioneer had been in the business long enough to know what a commercial buyer looked like, and he knew what he was looking at when he looked at Corinne Vickers. She was not a commercial buyer. She was a woman standing alone in the back of a crowd of men in Overton County, Tennessee, holding a numbered paddle she'd collected from the registration table, without being asked whether she was there on someone else's behalf, which was the question the man in front of her had been asked. She paid $65. She loaded the 4 animals herself into a borrowed trailer, while the crowd moved on to the next lot, which was a set of Angus cross heifers that sold for considerably more and generated considerably more interest. The 4 Randall linebacks were bony and rough-coated from the winter. The bull had a bad eye. 2 of the cows were visibly older than the auction sheet suggested. The 4th animal, a young cow, was the only one that looked like she had much future ahead of her. And even she was not the kind of animal that turned heads in 1959, when what turned heads in Overton County was a Hereford with a deep chest and a quick frame that would grade choice at the packing house in 12 to 14 months. The Randall lineback was not that animal. It was a dual-purpose breed, old colonial stock, the kind of cattle that had worked American farms for 2 centuries before the industry decided that specialization was the future and dual purpose was the past. By 1959, the breed was so rare that most of the buyers at that dispersal sale had never seen one before and did not particularly want to see one again. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties, from the sale barn to the feed store on the Cookeville Highway, from the feed store to the co-op on the south side of Livingston, from the co-op to the diner on the square, from the diner to the church parking lot on Sunday morning. By the time it reached the church parking lot, the $65 had become $40 in some versions, and the number of animals had become 2 in others, and the consensus arrived at, without much deliberation, was that Corinne Vickers had made a foolish purchase, and that this was not entirely surprising, given that she was running her grandfather's farm without a husband and without a hired man, and was known to have opinions about things that women in Overton County were not traditionally expected to have opinions about. Her brother-in-law, Gerald Vickers, said it plainly at the co-op the following Saturday. He said those animals are 100 years out of date, and she's going to spend more feeding them than she'll ever get back. And if she needed cattle, she should have bought cattle that somebody actually wants to buy. He was not wrong about what the market wanted. He was wrong about almost everything else. Let me tell you about Corinne Vickers, because what she did with those 4 animals over the next 30 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and what she was working from. Corinne Elaine Vickers, born Corinne Elaine Mabry, came into the world in 1928 on a farm in Overton County that her grandfather, Harlan Mabry, had homesteaded in 1887 and paid off in full by 1901. Harlan Mabry did not believe in carrying debt across a calendar year. He had written that down in the farm ledger in 1901, and every subsequent entry in that ledger, kept first by Harlan and then by his son Thomas, and then by Thomas's wife Eunice when Thomas's hands got bad, reflected that belief. The ledger was still in the farmhouse when Corinne was born. It was still in the farmhouse when she was a girl, sitting at the kitchen table watching her grandmother make entries in it on Sunday evenings after supper. It was still in the farmhouse in 1959 when she came home from the dispersal sale with 4 animals that nobody wanted. Harlan Mabry had kept Randall Lineback cattle on that farm from the beginning, not because he was sentimental about them, though he may have been, but because a dual-purpose animal made sense on a farm that needed both milk and beef and could not afford to run 2 separate operations for each. The Linebacks gave enough milk to supply the household and a few neighbors and enough beef when a steer was finished to bring something at market. They were hardy animals, adapted to the hill country of Middle Tennessee, resistant to the heat and the parasites and the foot problems that plagued the more refined breeds. Harlan Mabry's veterinary expenses, recorded in the same ledger that tracked every other farm cost, were remarkably small. He noted this himself in 1923 in a margin entry that read, "These cattle do not require much doctoring. That is their best quality." Thomas Mabry, Corinne's father, kept the Linebacks through the Depression and through the war years, and through the post-war period when his neighbors were beginning to sell off their mixed herds and replace them with commercial breeds. Thomas was not opposed to commercial breeds on principle. He just didn't see the point of changing something that was working. He told Corinne when she was about 14 that the reason people chased the new thing was usually that someone was selling it, and that the person selling it was not the same person who would be feeding it through a hard winter. Thomas Mabry died in the spring of 1957, 2 years before the dispersal sale, of a heart condition that had been developing quietly for most of a decade. He left Corinne the farm, 211 acres, in the hill country southeast of Livingston, paid for. He left her the herd, which by then had dwindled to 6 animals because Thomas had been too sick to manage the breeding program properly in his last years. He left her the ledger. He left her the habit of writing everything down. He also left her something that isn't usually counted as an inheritance. He left her his understanding of what the Randall Lineback actually was, which was different from what the market said it was. Thomas Mabry had spent 40 years observing those animals in close quarters, and he had reached conclusions about them that the breed literature of the 1950s had not yet caught up to. He believed the Linebacks were healthier than the commercial breeds, not by accident, but by design. That centuries of selection for hardiness in colonial American conditions had produced an animal with a constitution that the modern packing house breeds, selected almost entirely for growth rate and carcass yield, had lost. He told Corinne this in the last winter of his life, sitting in the kitchen with the ledger open on the table between them. He said, "These cattle will outlast every Hereford in this county." She wrote that down. Now, the dispersal sale. When Corinne Vickers looked at those 4 Randall Linebacks in the sale pen in the spring of 1959, she did not see what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw an obsolete breed in poor condition being sold off by an estate that had no use for them, which was accurate as far as it went. Corinne saw the last remnant of a bloodline that was disappearing from American agriculture faster than anyone was paying attention to, and she saw an opportunity to bring that bloodline back to the farm, where it belonged. She also saw something more specific, which was that the young cow in the group, the one that still had some future ahead of her, had structural characteristics that matched the best animals her father had kept. Wide-hipped, deep-bodied, good feet. The kind of animal that would breed well and milk well and hold her condition through a dry summer without being pampered. Corinne had not decided to bid on those animals at the dispersal sale. She had decided 6 months earlier, when she heard through the co-op that the Denton estate was liquidating and that the Denton family had been one of the last operations in Middle Tennessee, still running a lineback herd. She had driven out to the Denton place in the fall of 1958 and asked to look at the cattle. She had spent 2 hours in the field with them, taking notes in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She had gone home and looked at her grandfather's ledger entries from the 1910s and 1920s, comparing the descriptions of his best animals to what she had seen at the Denton place. She had decided which animals she wanted before she ever set foot at the sale. The $65 was not an impulse. It was the final step of a plan she had been working for half a year. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a woman who had paid $65 for cattle nobody wanted. They were watching a woman who had identified the last available source of a bloodline her grandfather had spent 50 years building and had secured it for $65 before it was gone forever. Let me tell you about what she did with those animals over the next decade, because this is where the story stops being about a dispersal sale and starts being about something else entirely. Corinne Vickers brought the 4 linebacks home to the farm and put them in the south pasture, which was the best drained ground on the property, with good fescue and some native grass she had been managing carefully since her father's last good year. She kept the old bull through 1 breeding season, enough to get the young cow settled, and then she sold him and began the slow work of rebuilding the herd through careful selection. She was not in a hurry. She understood that you could not rebuild a breeding population in a year or 2, that the work was generational, and that the first requirement was to not make mistakes that you couldn't undo. She kept the ledger the way her grandmother had kept it, the way her father had kept it, entries on Sunday evenings after supper. Every animal had a page: birth date, dam, sire, where known, weight at weaning, weight at 1 year, any health events, any treatments, any costs. She recorded the veterinary expenses for each animal individually. In the first 10 years of her lineback herd, from 1959 through 1969, her total veterinary expenditure for the cattle operation was $212. That included a difficult calving in 1963 that required the vet to come out, a foot abscess on one of the older cows in 1966, and a consultation in 1968 when she was uncertain about a respiratory issue that turned out to resolve on its own. $212 over 10 years for a herd that had grown by 1969 to 14 animals. Her neighbors were not having the same experience. The commercial Hereford and Angus operations in Overton County through the 1960s were dealing with the standard costs of commercial cattle production: pink eye, foot rot, respiratory disease in the calves, internal parasites that required regular deworming, hardware disease, the various ailments that came with animals bred for production, in controlled conditions being asked to perform in the variable conditions of a Middle Tennessee hill farm. These were not catastrophic costs in any individual year, but they accumulated. A deworming program for a 50-head commercial herd cost money twice a year. Pink eye treatments cost money. Calf scours cost money and sometimes cost calves. The veterinarians in Overton County were busy men. Corinne's vet bills were, in the words of her vet, Dr. Earl Chadwick of Livingston, genuinely unusual. He told her this in 1967 when he stopped by the farm for something unrelated and walked the south pasture with her. He said he had been in practice for 19 years, and he had never had a client whose cattle records looked like hers. She showed him the ledger. He stood at the fence for a long time, looking at the linebacks in the pasture, which by then were a healthy and visibly thriving group of animals, and he asked her what she was doing differently. She said she wasn't doing anything differently. She said the cattle were doing it themselves. He took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck and said he supposed that was one way to look at it. The word spread, but it spread differently this time. Not from the feed store to the co-op to the diner the way the mockery had spread in 1959. This time it spread from farmer to farmer, the slower and more serious kind of information transfer that happens when one man tells another man something he saw with his own eyes. Earl Chadwick told 2 of his clients. Those 2 clients told their neighbors. By the early 1970s, several farmers in Overton County had asked Corinne if she would sell breeding stock, and she had sold a young bull and 3 heifers to operations that were willing to move away from the purely commercial model. She priced them fairly. She did not price them as rare breeds because she did not think of them as rare breeds. She thought of them as working cattle. If you have ever watched a community slowly reverse a judgment it made in public, watch the silence replace the laughter without anyone acknowledging the transition, stick with me. Because what happened next in Overton County is the part that Harlan Mabry would have understood without a word of explanation. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 15 years, because this is where the story stops being about cattle and starts being about the arithmetic of independence. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, Corinne Vickers ran her farm the way her grandfather had run it, and the way her father had run it. She kept expenses below income every year. She kept the ledger every Sunday. She sold beef from her lineback steers to a small number of local buyers who had discovered that the meat was different from commercial beef, darker and more flavorful, with a fat distribution that the buyers described in various ways. But that all came down to the same thing, which was that it tasted like beef used to taste. She sold milk to 2 families in the county who wanted whole milk from a known source. She sold breeding stock when she had animals to spare. She did not expand faster than the land could support. Without inputs she would have to buy. By 1974, her herd stood at 23 animals. By 1974, her savings, kept in an account at the bank in Livingston that she had opened with the first surplus from the farm in 1958, stood at $14,000. By 1974, her farm had no mortgage, no operating loans, no equipment debt of any kind. Her grandfather's tractor, a 1948 Ford 8N, that her father had maintained with the same attention he gave the cattle, was still running. She had rebuilt the carburetor herself in 1971, using a kit she ordered from a supplier in Nashville, and a manual her father had kept in the shop drawer. The repair cost her $11 and a Saturday afternoon. Gerald Vickers, her brother-in-law, had by 1974 expanded his Hereford operation to 80 head on borrowed money and was servicing an operating loan that had grown with each successive year of expansion. He was not in trouble yet. The 1970s were good years for commodity cattle producers, with prices strong and credit available, and the general feeling in the agricultural lending community that land values would continue to rise and that debt secured by land was essentially riskless. Gerald Vickers felt this feeling. Most of the commercial cattle producers in Overton County felt this feeling. It was a reasonable feeling to have in 1974. It became a less reasonable feeling to have in 1981. You know what happened in the early 1980s. If you grew up in a farming county or if you had family who did, you know what happened. Interest rates that had been climbing through the late 1970s reached 18% in 1981 and stayed near that level for 2 years. Land values, which had been the collateral for a decade of agricultural borrowing, collapsed. Corn and cattle prices fell. Farms that had been profitable on paper in 1978 were insolvent on paper by 1982 and in foreclosure by 1983 and 1984. In Overton County, Tennessee, 11 farms went to auction between 1982 and 1986. 11 farms that families had worked for generations, gone in the space of 4 years because the arithmetic that had looked reasonable in 1974 looked like a trap in 1982. Gerald Vickers sold his Hereford herd in the fall of 1982 at prices that did not cover what he owed on the operating loan he had taken to buy them. He kept the land, barely, by refinancing at terms that cost him for years afterward. He did not lose the farm. He came close enough that he did not speak about it in public for a long time. Corinne Vickers's expenses in 1982 were what they had always been. Feed costs for a herd she owned outright, property taxes on land she owned outright, maintenance on equipment she owned outright. Her veterinary bill for 1982 was $31, a single farm call for a calving complication. Her total operating costs for 1982, recorded in the ledger on the Sunday evening of the last day of December, were $4,180. Her income for 1982 was $6,240. She wrote the surplus in the ledger the way her grandmother had written surpluses, in the same column with the same pen. Her expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there had never been anything borrowed to cut. The farm ran on what it produced, and what it produced was determined by the land and the cattle and the weather and her own labor, none of which were subject to an interest rate set in Washington. In the spring of 1984, 140 acres of hill pasture adjacent to Corin's south boundary went to auction as part of a farm bankruptcy proceeding. The land had belonged to the Pettigrew family, who had farmed it since before Thomas Mabry was born. Ray Pettigrew had expanded his beef operation in the late 1970s on borrowed money and had not been able to service the debt when the rates went up and the prices went down. He was not a bad farmer. He was a farmer who had built his operation on borrowed money in a decade, when borrowed money felt like the only way to grow. And when the conditions changed, the borrowed money became the thing that ended him. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in April. There were speculators from Nashville and Cookeville, men in trucks who bought distressed agricultural land and held it or subdivided it. There were a few farmers from the county who had survived the crisis, with enough credit remaining to bid, though not many. Corinne Vickers drove to the auction in her father's truck, which she had maintained the same way she maintained everything else, and she stood near the back of the crowd, the way she had stood at the dispersal sale in 1959. The bidding opened at $400 an acre. The speculators pushed it to $550. Corinne bid $600. A speculator from Cookeville bid $625. Corinne bid $650. The speculator looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the land, and then did not bid again. 140 acres at $650 per acre. $91,000. She wrote a check. The crowd went quiet in the way that a crowd goes quiet when it is rearranging everything. It thought it knew about a situation. Not loud quiet, not dramatic quiet. The specific quiet of people recalculating. The auctioneer confirmed the bid and the payment method and moved on because that was his job. But the people standing in that field in April of 1984 did not move on as quickly. They stood there for a moment with the information settling. Gerald Vickers was at that auction. He had come to watch, not to bid, because he was in no position to bid. He stood near the back of the crowd, and he watched his sister-in-law write a check for $91,000 for land adjacent to a farm she had owned free and clear for 27 years. And he did not say anything. He found her afterward near the truck, and he stood there for a moment with his cap in his hands, and he said, "Your daddy would have known what to say about this." She said, "He did say it. He said it to me in the kitchen in 1956. Gerald nodded and put his cap back on and walked to his truck. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Let me tell you about the years after 1984, because the story doesn't end at the auction. It continues the way good farms continue, quietly and without ceremony. Corinne Vickers farmed the expanded operation, 211 original acres, plus the 140 Pettigrew acres, for another 18 years after the land auction. She expanded the lineback herd to accommodate the additional pasture, reaching a peak of 41 animals by 1989. She continued to sell breeding stock to farmers in Overton County, and by the late 1980s, to buyers in other states, because the Randall lineback had begun to attract attention from a small but growing community of farmers interested in heritage breeds and sustainable production, and Corinne's herd, with its documented lineage going back to her grandfather's original animals, was one of the most genetically significant lineback herds in the eastern United States. She did not seek this recognition. It found her. The American Livestock Breeds Conservancy, which had been working to document and preserve rare American breeds since the late 1970s, sent a researcher to the farm in 1991. The researcher, a young woman from Vermont named Susan Hartley, spent 3 days at the farm going through the ledger and examining the herd. She told Corinne that the breeding records in that ledger, going back to Harlan Mabry's first entries in the 1890s, were among the most complete lineback records in existence. Corinne showed her the 1923 margin entry in her grandfather's handwriting. These cattle do not require much doctoring. That is their best quality. Susan Hartley copied it into her own notebook. The veterinary records that Hartley reviewed during those 3 days showed something that she later described in a published report as remarkable. Over 32 years of continuous lineback production on the Vickers farm, from 1959 through 1991, the total veterinary expenditure for the cattle operation was $947 for a herd that had ranged from 4 to 41 animals over that period. That number was not a rounding error. It was a demonstration of something that the breed literature had asserted, but that almost no one had documented with the precision that Corinne's ledger provided. $947 in 32 years. Her neighbors running commercial operations of comparable size had spent that in a single bad year, sometimes in a single bad season. Corinne's grandniece, a girl named Patty Mabry, who was the daughter of Corinne's nephew on the Mabry side, began spending summers on the farm in 1988 when she was 12 years old. By the time she was 15, she was doing real work, not the decorative kind of work that adults sometimes assign to children to make them feel useful, but actual work with actual consequences. She learned to read the cattle, the way Corinne had learned to read them, which was the way Thomas Mabry had learned, and the way Harlan Mabry had learned before him, which was by spending time with them in the field and paying attention to what you saw. She learned to keep the ledger. She learned which animals to breed and which to sell, and which to keep back for another year to see how they developed. She learned it the way all the important things on that farm had been learned, which was by doing it alongside someone who already knew. In the summer of 1993, Corinne asked Patty if she wanted to take over the farm. Patty was 17. She said yes without taking a day to think about it. Corinne spent the next 4 years teaching her everything that wasn't already in the ledger, and in 1997, she transferred the deed to Patty Mabry, all 351 acres paid for, with a herd of 38 Randall linebacks and a set of farm records going back to 1887. The transfer was not a dramatic event. There was no ceremony. Corinne drove to the county clerk's office in Livingston on a Thursday morning and signed the paperwork and drove home, and they had supper together, and Corinne showed Patty the ledger entry for the transfer, which read, 351 acres, Overton County, Tennessee. Transferred to Patricia Ann Mabry, March 14th, 1997. Paid for. Corinne Vickers spoke at an agricultural extension meeting in Livingston in the fall of 1998, the only public speech she ever gave about the farm. The extension agent had invited her after the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy report had circulated, and several local farmers had asked to hear her speak. She was 70 years old. She stood at the front of the room for about 12 minutes and said what she had to say in plain language without notes. She said that she had kept the same cattle her grandfather kept because her grandfather had been right about them and the market had been wrong about them, and that the market being wrong about something did not make the thing wrong. She said that the veterinary savings over 40 years had amounted to more money than most people spent on a new truck, and that a new truck depreciated and a healthy breeding herd appreciated, and that this seemed like an important difference. She said that the farm had survived the 1980s, not because she had been clever or lucky, but because she had not borrowed money she did not need to borrow, and that this was not a complicated idea, but it was an idea that required a person to be willing to look foolish in the short term in order to be right in the long term. She said that she had looked foolish at a dispersal sale in 1959, and that she had been comfortable with that. She said one other thing. She said that her grandfather had written in the ledger in 1923 that these cattle do not require much doctoring, and that this was the most valuable piece of agricultural information she had ever received, and that she had received it for free, and that free information from someone who had spent a lifetime learning something was worth more than any amount of paid advice from someone who had a product to sell. Gerald Vickers was in the room. He had come without being asked. He sat in the third row, and he listened to the whole 12 minutes without moving. When she finished, he was the first one to put his hands together. "Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at 4 rough-coated, old-fashioned cattle in a sale pen in 1959, being sold by an estate that had no use for them, going for $65 to a woman standing alone in the back of a crowd?" Most people in Overton County saw a foolish purchase. They saw an obsolete breed, a sentimental woman, $65 badly spent on animals that the market had already decided were finished. Corinne Vickers saw her grandfather's herd. She saw an animal that did not require much doctoring. She saw a bloodline that was about to disappear if someone didn't pay $65 to stop it. She saw 30 years of veterinary bills that would never appear in her ledger. She saw 140 acres of her neighbor's land that she would buy with cash in 1984, while her neighbor stood in the crowd and watched. She saw a farm that would still be in her family's hands in 1997 and beyond, paid for, with records going back to 1887, with cattle that were the direct descendants of animals her grandfather had chosen because they were hardy and honest and did not require much doctoring. That is the difference between a buyer and a builder. A buyer pays what the market asks and gets what the market offers. A builder looks at what everyone else has decided is worthless and asks a different question. Not what is this worth today, but what will this be worth to the person who understands it? $65. A dispersal sale in Overton County, Tennessee. A bloodline that was almost gone. In the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the ledger proved she had understood everything.